There we go. So, our portion today is Yitro, found on page 432 in our Eitz Chaim, or it's the beginning of chapter 18 in the book of Exodus. So whatever Chumash you're using, look for the portion Yitro or Jethro for chapter 18 of Exodus. One person coming in. Right. So, waiting for him to there. So, as I said, the portion is Yitro 432 and Eitz Chaim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So, the portion is called Yitro, as most portions in the Torah are referred to by the first significant word in the first line of the portion. So, Vayishma Yitro, Jethro heard, Kohen Midian, who's Jethro? He's a priest of Midian, Chotain Moshe, the father-in-law of Moses, Et kol asher aseh Elohim LaMoshe. All that, so if I translate it all so far, Jethro, a priest of Midian, the father-in-law of Moses, heard all that God did for Moses. Uli Israel amo, ki hotzi Adonai et Israel mimitzrayim. So Jethro, the priest of Midian, the father-in-law of Moses, heard all that God did for Moses and Israel, his people, that God brought Israel out of Egypt. Okay, so what did Jethro hear? He heard that that God had brought Israel out of Egypt. Now, and most specifically, including his son-in-law. So, a couple things about this. First, we assume, because we've read the Torah so far, that God has directed everything that has happened in the Torah so far. From the creation of the world in chapter 1 of Genesis, all the way to this point, God is the prime mover and actor in history. That God created the world, God brought the flood, God saved Noah and his family, and a pair of all animals. God chose Abraham and Sarah to be the founders of the Israelite nation. God intervened to make sure that Abraham's servant Eliezer would find a bride for Isaac, etc., etc. So the way the Torah describes it, the events in history are such that it's clear for the author of the Torah that God is directing everything. Okay, and so again, this may not be a significant statement, but I think it's important to state it because not everybody has a perspective on history in the same way, and not just in history, a perspective on how things happen in our lives. So the Torah teaches quite clearly that God is behind everything. And that's not necessarily a way that we need to view the world around us, but it is the traditional Jewish way to view how the world happens, right? So when Israel was established in 1948, a prayer was written in response, which clearly states, thank God for causing the state of Israel to come into being. Now, you might argue, one could argue that Theodore Herzl had something to do with it. And maybe David Ben-Gurion and other leaders in the land of Israel at the time had something to do with it. But the prayer says at least that God had everything to do with it, if not God working in partnership with people, right? So an important understanding for how we view events happening around us, and then events more globally in the world around us and in history, is that God directs everything. So there's a problem, no, not a problem. There's a challenge with that theology when bad things happen in the world around us, right? Did God cause the earthquake to happen yesterday, which so far has killed over 11,000 people? Did hurricanes, the series of storms that came to California and then stretched over the West, and some of them reached us as well a few weeks ago, did God cause those storms to happen too? Did God cause bad things that happen in the world, and the most extreme of which being the Holocaust? So if one argues that God is the prime mover of events in the world, one has to be consistent in accepting that God causes good things and bad things to happen. Okay, so that's I'm oversimplifying. I know that. There's lots of serious works of Jewish theology which expand upon this and explain it in great detail. But suffice it to say that this is the traditional theology, that we accept events that happen in our lives as caused by God, both bad and good. And that's the theology that comes across loud and clear in the Torah. What prompted me to go off on this is that the Torah presents Jethro, this Midianite priest, as understanding what just happened in the same way. So it's not just an Israelite Jewish perspective that God caused the Exodus to happen. It is a universal perspective, in that Jethro understood it too. So Jethro heard. We could also understand the word Vayishma as understood. So Jethro understood that it was God who caused the events to happen and in this way. And so, in other words, that Jethro is accepting the idea that there is God, that Yud-He Vav-He exists. Well, no, Elohim. God is referred to as Elohim in this verse. Oh, and also as Yud-He Vav-He. So Yitro accepts Elohim and Yud-He Vav-He as the divine cause for what happened. Okay, so I think that's another significant point that this first verse of our portion is trying to teach us, that we think we're learning a particular Israelite Jewish perspective on theology, but we should understand that it's a universal perspective, that our relationship with God is not unique to us, it is open to all. So now Lori put in the chat, does the conservative movement follow that traditional perspective? So let me answer by saying yes and no. So the conservative movement offers conservative movement ideology offers a broad range of theological perspectives. And in a book behind me, just one second here. Just looking for it. Elliot Dorff wrote a book on From Our Ancestors to Our Descendants. It was a paperback book used by USY International convention to teach about Jewish theology. And of course, when I need to find the book on my shelf, I can't find it. I'll probably find it after class. But in there, he has a chart of theological perspectives that are acceptable within the conservative movement. From this traditional perspective that I just presented, that God is the prime mover and actor and causing everything to happen around us, and it's more, and then we're applying it, or he applies it in his book, and the theology for the conservative movement is really surrounding the events that happen here in this portion, namely the giving of the Torah and the revelation of the Ten Commandments at Mount Sinai. Okay, so the traditional perspective is, as the portion presents it, that God spoke at Mount Sinai. The entire community of Israel heard it, and God gave Moses literally the entire Torah. God taught it to Moses, and God gave it to Moses in its entirety while Moses was up on Mount Sinai for 40 days and nights. Okay, so that's the most traditional perspective. It is the perspective of the Orthodox movement, and it is a perspective within the conservative movement. I'm not so sure how common it is today, but perhaps in the time when Elliot Dorff wrote that book, which was about 40 years ago, it might have been a little bit more common, in that the conservative movement at the time, 40 years ago, was a more traditional movement, and there were more synagogues that were not yet egalitarian around. I think today there are hardly any conservative synagogues that are not egalitarian. Could probably count them on one hand in North America, okay? Which wasn't the case 40 years ago. You would need both hands and feet and a few other hands and feet for non-egalitarian synagogues that were part of the conservative movement. Okay, so this theology is in relationship to how we understand Torah and the Jewish people and God's role in the Torah. So the next layer down would be that God spoke the Torah and Moses wrote it down. So there's still divine and God involvement in the Torah. There's still sanctity to the Torah because God spoke it, but Moses wrote it down, which could reflect on why there are scribal errors in the Torah itself. Okay, because Moses is a human being, and no matter how great a secretary there is, you can be, you still make mistakes. And Moses didn't proofread, which leads to the next layer down, that perhaps Moses and the elders of the community wrote it down. Or, next layer down, perhaps there's an oral tradition that the Mount Sinai experience happened, and it was written down later in history, perhaps at the time of King David, or perhaps at the time of the exile in Babylonia. Okay, so you go from God involvement to entirely human involvement, but all reflect around a divine, at least a sanctity to the text. So the implications are around evolution of Jewish law and how much we are allowed to alter or change Jewish law. The more we think God is involved in writing the Torah, the less we are able to interpret the Torah and change it, which reflects on why the Orthodox movement in Judaism does not change Jewish law too much, if at all, whereas the conservative movement does. Okay, so again, this is an oversimplification of this, which could require several lectures to explain all of these perspectives. But I've taught this before, spoken about it many, many times. So unless there's more follow-up with questions or comments about this, let's go on, and let me reflect again on this very first verse of our portion, in that Yitro heard everything that God did for Israel in taking them out of Egypt. Okay, the verse could have very well have said, God heard that Yitro heard everything that had happened to Moses and Israel in leaving Egypt. And it could very well have left God out of it. But because the verse included God, I think the Torah wants to teach us that Jethro was accepting of this perspective, or this understanding that Yud-He Vav-He exists as an entity, and that Yitro is accepting Yud-He Vav-He himself into his life. And I think that's an important statement that the Torah is trying to teach in the universality of this experience. Okay, and so there's commentary as the portion goes on about why the Sinai experience happened in the wilderness, right? So in other words, if we want to see the Torah as unique to the Israelite Jewish people, that as a unique story in the creation of the Israelite Jewish people, then why wasn't the Torah given in Jerusalem or somewhere in the land of Israel? If the Torah is the book that is the guide for how the people of God live in the land of God, in the land of Israel, then why wasn't the Torah, the word of God, given in the land of God to the people of God? Right? That's the question that commentators have asked over the centuries, and the answer. So why it's given in the wilderness is to show that it was equal access to all. Right? So that, yeah, we were there, but there are other people around too. Anybody could have been there to be part of that awesome experience. So that's the lesson behind why it happened in the wilderness. There's another note about the very first verse, right? What is Jethro hearing, and why is it right? Well, you have to understand, right? As I've mentioned before in this class, just because the portion starts here doesn't mean that it's a portion in and of itself. We have to understand the context from how our story is continuing, right? And from one Shabbat to the next, we might forget how last week's portion ended, but we should turn back and turn to page 420, 421 for the end of last week's portion, B'Shalach. So this is chapter 17, beginning with verse 8. So what happened right before we're reintroduced to Jethro here? 420, Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. Moses said to Joshua, pick some men for us, go do battle with Amalek, etc., etc. And then 14, then the Lord said to Moses, inscribe this in a document as a reminder, read it aloud to Joshua, I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. And Moses built an altar and named it Adonai Nisi. He said it means hand upon the throne of the Lord. The Lord will be at war with Amalek throughout the ages. So right, and then the very next sentence is, Jethro heard everything that happened that God did in bringing the people out of Egypt. But why does this happen right after the war with Amalek? And here, let's look at the commentary below the line, where right in the bottom left of the column, chapter 18, Jethro heard. The sages understand that the Torah reports this event right after the encounter with Amalek to assure us that not all Gentiles are wicked enemies of Israel. So let's just a second before I go on here. Chapter 19 of Exodus, which starts the fourth Aliyah. Yeah, the fourth Aliyah on 436 at chapter 19, that tells us that it's in the third month that they get to Mount Sinai. Chapter 18 here doesn't tell us when this happens. So it could have happened right after the war with Amalek, which was 3 days after leaving Egypt. Or anywhere in between the 3 days after leaving Egypt to the third month out of Egypt. Okay, so we're not told exactly when Jethro heard this and came to Moses. Okay, so if it happened close to the war with Amalek, that could have been the what prompted Jethro to make an appearance, and therefore then the commentary is teaching us to assure us that not all Gentiles are wicked enemies of Israel, right? In other words, part of the Jewish psyche, which we don't fully appreciate because of how safe it has been for us to live as Jews in America. So this time in America for Jews, despite the rise of anti-Semitism, is still a unique, safe time in the 4,000 years of Jewish history. So we have to keep that in mind, that is an integral part of what Jewish identity is, that we are always looking over our shoulder. We're always under threat by the outside Gentile environment in which we're living. That we never know when the sword is going to fall, and we're going to be in trouble, and we're going to have to pack our bags and move. Okay, again, as Jews in America, we don't think that way, and we haven't had to think that way, and that's a blessing. But the curse of that blessing is that we forget Jewish history. We're liable to forget Jewish history. And despite the fact that the Holocaust was 80 years ago, some of us don't think about it every day. And we don't recognize that anything could happen to us. So a story like Amalek should not be surprising to us from last week's portion, even though that was the first time that we were attacked by another nation. It's the first of hundreds of times throughout Jewish history in which we're attacked by another group of people or a country. Okay, so and therefore, why is this portion here, and why is Jethro here? To have us realize that not all Gentiles are our enemy. It's important to understand that there are good people among the Gentiles. Okay, so as the commentary goes on, although there are Amaleks, there are also Jethros. So this first statement is from Ibn Ezra. Ibn Ezra lived in Spain, in the golden age of Spain, 900 years ago. And in that time, he lived in Muslim Spain. So most of the Iberian Peninsula, that is Spain and Portugal, was under, in Ibn Ezra's time, was under Muslim rule. It was slowly, in Ibn Ezra's time, slowly the Christians were conquering the Iberian Peninsula from north heading south. Okay, but while the Iberian Peninsula was mostly under Muslim rule, it was good for the Jews. There were still some restrictions on Jewish life, in that synagogues couldn't be built taller than mosques, and maybe Jews had to dress a certain way. But otherwise, Jews, I think, were treated very fairly in the Muslim world, and were able to achieve the highest positions in the Muslim government, in the Muslim palace. So Ibn Ezra was such a person. There are many other people at that time. So even in his time, you have to be wary of the Gentiles. And he said, this is here to teach us that there are Jethros among the Gentiles. Okay, and the commentary goes on. We're in the right hand column below the line on 432. The name of Jethro is perpetually linked with the reading that includes the giving of the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, which is later in this portion, where a people who long remember the goodness of righteous Gentiles. Now, this portion could have been called Vayishma, and it could have made more sense to call this portion Vayishma. There are other verbs, right? We have Vayetze in the book of Genesis. We have the portion Vayishlach, Vayeshev. These are verbs that are names of portions in the book of Genesis. So why couldn't this portion be called Vayishma, the first word of the portion? So I think the rabbis also are making this point that it's coming across here. Better to have the portion called Yitro and understand the universality behind the Ten Commandments and the giving of the Ten Commandments, as opposed to he heard, which just implies that we're remembering what we heard at Mount Sinai. That could be the relationship with the verb with what happens in the portion. Better to call it Jethro. So now the question is, what exactly did Jethro hear when it says in this verse that he heard God, all that God did in bringing the people out of Egypt? Are we saying positive things about Jethro and what he heard, or negative? So let's go on. What did Jethro hear that moved him to associate himself with the people of Israel? Some say he heard about their suffering in Egypt and was moved by pity. Okay, so maybe he wanted to offer help and felt sympathetic to the suffering of the people. That could be one idea of why Jethro was able to hear, to be sympathetic. Some say he heard of their triumph over Pharaoh's army and wanted to associate himself with a victorious people, right? The hearing there is, hey, I got to be with people for whom it's good. Because if it's good for them and I come along, maybe it'll be good for me too, right? Life is tough when you're living in a place that is overrun by conquering hordes. So better to be on the side of the newly victorious, so I'll be protected. Okay, so maybe there's personal necessity in Jethro teaming up with his son-in-law and their people. Others say he heard that the Israelites were on their way to a rendezvous with God, that they were destined to be a special people, and he wanted to share in their destiny. So maybe it was purely altruistic, if not religious and spiritual. Jethro was aware of God's relationship to the people, and he wanted to be with the people to have some of that spirituality influence him too. So was it pity? Was it purely selfish? Or was it spiritual? So that's interesting from commentaries, different perspectives about Jethro. So even though we want to be kind to Jethro, in some regards, maybe the commentary wasn't so kind that he wasn't purely altruistic in his hearing and joining them. So another thing I wanted to say about this first verse is that this portion itself in its entirety, especially focusing, it's the sixth aliyah, well, the fifth aliyah on, in which the people are preparing themselves for God's revelation at Mount Sinai, and then the people hearing God speak at Mount Sinai. Some say that this is the most important portion in all of the portions of the Torah. And so I would question that. Might we argue that maybe the first portion in the Torah about God creating the world in 7 days and creating humanity with the opportunity to be aware of God's presence. Couldn't that be the most important Torah portion? Maybe, if we're talking about the history of the Jewish people, as the Torah is supposed to be partly teaching us, if not mostly in its entirety teaching us, then maybe God choosing Abraham and Sarah as the founders of the Israelite Jewish people, chapter 12 of Genesis, should be the most important portion of all the portions. Or maybe chapter 19 and 20 of the book of Leviticus, presenting to us what's called the Holiness Code, what it means, all the statements to follow to be a moral, ethical, religious people. Maybe that's the most important. Or one could argue, how about the incident of the spies that happens in chapter 13 in the book of Numbers, in which the people argue again? So we could put that with the golden calf incident, that is totally abandoning faith in God. That's the spy story, and it's the golden calf story, which continues in that the people have Aaron fashion a replacement god, the golden calf itself. Maybe these stories are the most essential stories because it reflects on the personality of our ancestors. The Israelite Jewish people are a stiff-necked people that forget the good things that happen to them and forget God's presence easily, and are always asking, what has God done for me lately? And maybe that's a lesson that we're supposed to be learning for the Torah. So I'm just suggesting, I'm not sure if there's one particular section of the Torah that is the most important section of the Torah, outweighing all the other sections. I think all that I have mentioned, and maybe you can bring up other sections of the Torah too, that are just as important for the moral and spiritual teaching for our people. So just the very first line of the commentary below the line is, this parsha can be seen as the hinge of the Torah, containing the pivotal event in the history of the Israelite people and indeed of all humanity. So I would just argue, I'm not so sure that this is the hinge. I think there are a number of hinges that go together. I don't think it's fair to just narrow it down to one hinge. I see the point of doing it. It makes it easier to teach a particular lesson, but I think it leaves out then the other stories and the bigger picture. So you can't just narrow everything down just to one thing. It has to be seen in the bigger picture. Just a second, my phone's ringing, and okay. So that's what I wanted to look at also. And let's turn ahead now to the start of chapter 19, which is the beginning of the fourth aliyah of Yitro, page 436 in the Eitz Chaim. But again, it's chapter 19 of Exodus, the fourth aliyah. So this is where we're told, and this is the intro to this 10 Commandment event. Hold on one second. I think somebody's at the door and there's nobody here. So 1 second. Sorry about that. An Amazon delivery. Okay, so chapter 19 here, page 436. introduces us to this pivotal Mount Sinai event. So it starts B'chodesh Hashlishi, in the third month, Litzeit B'nai Yisrael Me'eretz Mitzrayim, the third month from the exodus of the people of Israel from the land of Egypt. Bayom Hazeh, on that day, literally it's on this day. I've talked about that before. See other recordings about the Bayom Hazeh as opposed to Bayom Hahu. On this day, they came to the Sinai desert or the Sinai wilderness. So there's comment below about the third month. Why? What is there something significant about the third month? Now, certainly, it leads to the holiday of Shavuot and providing a date for observing Shavuot as 7 weeks after Passover and the 6th day of the month of Sivan. So when we count the Omer, we're counting up to the holiday of Shavuot, and then Passover and Shavuot then are linked in that the Exodus from Egypt was all about getting to Mount Sinai to receive the Torah and to become the people of Israel as guided by the Torah. Okay, so for the rabbis and for Judaism in particular, it's important to have the date given for when the event at Mount Sinai occurred. Okay, but there's interesting below the line on 436 about the third month. So on the third new moon, the sages, noting that the zodiacal sign for the third month, the month of Sivan, is Gemini, the twins, take it as symbolizing the equal importance of the written Torah and the oral Torah. Now, let's stop there and just understand. I think I've talked about this before. The signs of the zodiac, the rabbis knew about that from the time of the Mishnah, the time of the Talmud. Mosaic floors that have been found in ancient synagogues have beautiful representations of the signs of the zodiac on the floor. So it means then everybody was aware of the signs of the zodiac, and the Jewish people, even the rabbis, took it as just standard way of understanding the calendar to incorporate the symbols of the zodiac so that each month had a particular sign of the zodiac that went along with it. Doesn't mean that they were into astrology for determining their life, but the signs of the zodiac are interesting, and they make for interesting midrash, like we're about to read, right? So the first month Nisan, second month Iyar, third month Sivan. So Sivan, the sign for, and this is, I get a wall calendar from a yeshiva in Manhattan, all written in Hebrew. I get it every year. I do pay for it, but I get it every year. This wall calendar provides the every day of the year where something different is happening in the service. What prayers we're supposed to leave out, what we're supposed to add, if it's Passover, if it's Tu B'Shvat, like it was on Monday. So this luach, this wall calendar from a yeshiva, has a picture of the zodiac for each month. So this ultra-Orthodox yeshiva has pictures of the zodiac for the months of the year. Okay, so clearly then the months of the zodiac are incorporated into understanding the calendar. And like I said, there's midrash about it. So it shouldn't be, there's nothing bad, or it might be jarring to see the zodiac signs on the floor of a synagogue, but if we understand exactly that this is just the time in which they lived, and it was just a picture that everybody knew to associate with the months of the year. Okay, so here's the midrash for Gemini, the twins, that it represents the oral and written Torah. What does that mean? So that's understanding for the rabbis that the oral Torah, that is, the Mishnah and the Talmud, were given by God to Moses at Mount Sinai, which gets back to what we were talking about as we started class today, in that the theology of God working in history and in our lives today is in relationship to giving the Torah at Mount Sinai. And for the Orthodox and for traditional Judaism, as the rabbis were teaching in the Mishnah and the Talmud, that God gave the oral teaching to Moses at Mount Sinai too. So this is the teaching of the rabbis. The rabbis knew that how they were interpreting the Torah was new. It was not something that the people were used to before. The gradual acceptance of rabbinic view of how to be Israelite Jewish became quickly accepted after the temple was destroyed by the Romans. So the rabbinic view is that the Torah is meant to be the constitution, the foundation for daily living. And it's the rabbis who developed the guide to daily living from the outline that is contained in the Torah. So that was new. All Israelites knew when the temple was standing in Jerusalem is when to go and bring a sacrifice and how to be sure to stay ritually pure. And if we became impure, how to go about getting ritually pure. So these are the basic elements of what it meant to be an Israelite when the temple was standing. The rabbis created a whole new system that enabled us to have encounters with God outside of the temple in Jerusalem. And they did that through their teaching, which became known as the oral Torah. Torah shebichtav is Hebrew for the written Torah. That's the 5 books of Moses. The Torah sheba'al peh, the oral Torah, is the Mishnah and the Gemara and everything after that. So for the rabbis knew that what they were teaching was new, but they wanted to give a sense of authority to what they were teaching. So they said that what they were teaching came from Moses at Mount Sinai. They said it. It's not true, but they said it. But it became part and parcel of what Rabbinic Judaism is, so that ultra-Orthodox Jews today and some regular Orthodox Jews today still believe that, which means that why you can't change anything in Jewish law, because even the oral Torah, the Mishnah and the Gemara, came from God to Moses at Mount Sinai too. The Mishnah begins that God gave the Torah to Moses at Mount Sinai, who gave it to Joshua, who gave it to the prophets, who gave it to the men of the Great Assembly. And the men of the Great Assembly are the rabbis of the Sanhedrin. So the rabbis say that was the chain of teaching, even though the rabbis would have to admit that they were teaching it from scratch themselves. So, but this is one of many midrashim to point out that both the written Torah and the oral Torah were given to Moses at Mount Sinai, in that it was given in the 3rd month, and it's Gemini, so the twins. So therefore, the Torah is teaching itself that the oral Torah was given. It's proof in that the sign of the zodiac was Gemini. Now, it just turns out, when were the signs of the zodiac becoming part of society? It wasn't at the time of the Torah and Mount Sinai, right? It was from the Greeks, right? The Greeks are after this, and the Greeks didn't get into the land of Israel until 400s, 300s BCE, like 800 years after this. So, we have to keep that in perspective too. So taking a modern time experience, that is the sign of the zodiac, and pushing it back to the time of the Torah, 1,000 years before the time of the rabbis, and then saying that that's proof that because the sign of the zodiac is Gemini and the Torah was given in the third month, that's proof that the oral Torah was given at Mount Sinai. So it's a backhanded, kind of twisted kind of teaching that the rabbis are offering here. But the other teaching relates to Jethro, and that not all Gentiles are bad, in that the commentary goes on, according to another interpretation, this teaches us, that is Gemini and the twins, that should Jacob's twin brother Esau change his wicked ways and come to accept the Torah, he would be welcomed. So what do we learn from Gemini, the twins, being the symbol for the month in which the Torah was given on Mount Sinai, is that anybody who has left us, left the community, left the Jewish religion on bad terms, is always welcome back if they have a change of heart, a sincere change of heart, and we're supposed to welcome them back with open arms. So that, I think, is a more universalistic kind of lesson than that about the oral Torah being given at Mount Sinai. So I like that lesson, that we should always be open to people who want to make amends and want to come back into the fold. So let's stop here for today. And I just wanted to say that next Wednesday, I will not be able to have class because of a conflicting appointment that I have. And 2 weeks from today, I'm not sure. So just stay tuned to your emails as to whether we'll have class 2 weeks from today. But next week, for sure, we do not have class. So have a good rest of the day, everybody. Enjoy the weather outside if you can, and take care, everybody.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yasher Koach.
Thank you.
Thank you.